Australia has very low homicide rates, and Australia has strict gun control. Therefore, strict gun control works. The United States has relatively high homicide rates and relatively permissive gun laws, very permissive gun laws as far as the world standard is concerned. Therefore, uh, liberal gun laws or gun availability causes crime to go up or causes there to be high homicide. Not only homicide, but quote unquote gun deaths. This is essentially the totality of the pro gun control argument. This is what most people find the most persuasive. These are the facts. I have yet to see a debate on gun control in the comment section of any venue, be it Facebook, YouTube, or whatever, where the proponents of gun control do not immediately start citing, juxtaposing the United States and Australia, or the United States and the UK, and saying, look at they'll usually say gun deaths. Sometimes they'll say homicide rate. Sometimes they'll say gun homicides, although that's unusual. And then say, haha, see, there's a correlation with gun restrictions and low homicide, ergo gun restrictions are effective. And this single kind of talking point rolls two fallacies at least together into one very succinct, nice little package. Um, and those are obviously that the correlation equals causation, which is one of the most famous logical fallacies that exists. The idea that if something is present, it must be the cause. Now, I think people understand that's false, but then there's something that people assume, well, intuitively, a law about gun control must have an effect, or that effect must be as the law intends. Therefore, it's not just correlation, that there's something about the nature of a gun restriction that necessarily means it must have an effect on gun law, on homicide rates or uses of guns in crime. On top of that, uh, there is the belief that correlation is being demonstrated if you compare two countries, the United States and Australia, or three countries, the United States, Australia, and the UK. But 3 points makes a triangle, not a statistical correlation or any correlation for that matter. Um, and what I've found very often when you start to debate this, you start to poke holes in the argument, and there are many holes. Uh, you can't just establish correlation by looking at three countries. You need to look at a way. The bigger the data set, the better, right? If we're talking about one or two countries, it's none. There's no statistical conclusions you can draw from that. If we're talking about countries, the only thing to really go is to look at all the countries in the world. And if you look at all the countries in the world and say which ones have strict, it's difficult because they don't all have, it's not binary where they have either strict laws or not strict laws. There's a spectrum. And the United States, in terms of legal availability, is very far on one end, maybe the farthest on one end. And then places like Australia and the UK, they're not at the very far end, because you certainly have countries that completely ban guns and outlaw them and penalize owning them quite severely. They just have very restrictive laws relative to other Western democracies, say like France or Germany, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Spain, Italy, Czech Republic, but uh, less restrictive than, say, Mexico or Russia or China or Japan. Uh, so if we look at the entire world, we don't really see a correlation either with total gun ownership rates, right? If we're just going to go by per capita, how many guns are there in a society? If you look at the top 10 countries in terms of per capita gun ownership, none of them are in the top 10 countries in terms of homicide, either gun homicide or total homicide, which doesn't make a lot of sense if we're assuming there's correlation. I believe the country that has the country with the highest homicide rate that's in the top 10, I think, is Paraguay, and I think it's like 60 in terms of homicide. Don't quote me on that. Um, but some of those countries, including Iceland, have the lowest homicide. Like Iceland is usually the country considered to have the lowest homicide rate, and it has actually in the top 10 per capita gun ownership. So not a lot of correlation there. But even further, there's not correlation within the countries mentioned. So we can pull up a graph of the homicide rate in Australia, and you'll see it goes up and it goes down. It's not flat, it goes up and down. And if I were to ask you, find where the gun control regulations were passed, and there's no dates on here, like if you know the date that it happened, you might able to do it. And I could probably pick it because I'm familiar with the curve because I've looked at it so many times. Um, but for the argument to be strong, you would want to have the regulations begin, and then you might allow for a slight delay, but then after their passage, see crime rates fall. Now, that still falls into the correlation equals causation fallacy because there's other possible things that could cause the homicide rate to go down besides gun regulations. But for the argument to make any sense at all, that's what you would want to see. And in the case of Australia, you do not see that. Australia's had a peak in homicide around 1988. It started to decline. The regulations restricting guns were implemented in 97, passed in 96, went into effect in 97, and homicide rates did fall after that, but they had been falling at a similar rate for 9 or 10 years prior to that. And then 3 or 4 years after the restrictions, they kind of the decline kind of stopped and it kind of flattened out. If we look at the UK, theirs is even worse. They've always had very low homicide rates, far lower than the United States, and this is another problem with the argument. But after their gun restrictions were passed, homicide rate actually increased. Now, it wasn't dramatic. It was just a slight elevation. It stayed elevated for about 7 years and then fell. It's not particularly persuasive. So we don't really have a correlation internally with these countries. And the United States, for instance, saw a decline in crime throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, even though it wasn't getting more restrictive laws, and the total number of guns in private hands was increasing. And in a lot of ways, gun laws were becoming more liberal in the United States. Right to carry, open carry, concealed carry, these things were all becoming more popular. The stock of privately held guns was increasing dramatically. So it's kind of interesting. All these Western countries are seeing a decline here, except kind of the UK. And you have Australia that does have gun restrictions, but they don't line up with a decline. The United States doesn't. It's still getting a decline. Seems like they're not necessarily that correlated. Again, if we look around the world, we don't see this. If you look at the entire world, there's no correlation. If you break it down into segments, you don't see a correlation. So if we only look at, say, Latin American countries, you don't see a correlation. If you only look at Eastern European countries, you don't see a correlation. If you look at African countries, you don't see a correlation. Even if you look at first world countries, you don't see a correlation. I remember reading a tremendous article by a liberal who was trying to show this, and he was this is where I'm getting this from. He's well, you don't see it in Latin America, and you don't see it here, and you don't see it in first world countries, but if you take out South Africa, which is usually considered a developed first world country, then you do see a very slight correlation. And he says, well, I'm going to take out South Africa because they have a history of racial violence that ups their crime, that ups their homicide rate. And that is skewing their because South Africa has fairly restrictive laws and has instituted fairly restrictive laws, and yet has a much higher homicide rate than the United States or any other country. So it completely ruins the correlation. So let's cherry pick that out. As if the United States, it's special pleading, right? Because the United States also has a history of, racial oppression and racial violence. And given the racial makeup of a large part of the homicide, it's entirely plausible, if not necessarily an established fact, that maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. So you don't see a big correlation here. There's also the problem of substitution. You can say gun deaths, and in the United States, most of those are going to be from suicides. Well, there's an ethical difference between a suicide and a homicide. There's no ethical distinction, though, between suicide by gun and other means. There's nothing worse about a gun suicide versus a non-gun suicide. And there's good evidence that restricting guns will reduce the gun deaths total because people who are committing suicide, many of them, instead of using a gun, will use something else. Now, people like to argue, well, guns are so effective at suicide that if you ban them and people have to use other means, won't that mean that there'll be a lower rate? Potentially in some cases, but really not. Guns are very effective, but they're not the only effective means. Among people who attempt suicide, there are people who are very serious about it and very committed to the idea of ending their lives, and there are people who are thinking about it but are not as committed to the idea, and there's a partial attempt to get attention. And I'm not saying that to minimize it or to say it's not a problem. It is a problem. Somebody who tries to overdose by taking too many pills, that is a problem. But they're not as dedicated to killing themselves as somebody who, say, jumps off of a 500-foot cliff or a large bridge or jumps in front of a moving train. If you look, Orange County, Los Angeles Coroner's Department actually keeps stats on statistically what are the most effective forms of suicide. And yes, a shotgun to the head is 99% effective, a self-inflicted shotgun to the head. But so is jumping in front of a train, a fast-moving train. Versus, like, say, slitting your wrist or trying to hang yourself, they have a lower rate. So uh, people who seriously want to commit suicide are seriously going to commit suicide. They're going to find a way that's 99, 98% effective, whether or not guns are available. So yes, you might push down the number of quote gun deaths, but you're not really reducing the suicide rate. And I mean, this is like saying like Japan doesn't have a suicide problem because they're not gun suicides. Japan has a horrible suicide problem. Japan's suicide problem in terms of deaths per capita per 100,000 is worse than the United States' suicide and homicide problem combined, right? More people kill themselves in Japan than kill themselves in the United States and are killed in the United States. And yet Japan is usually lauded because, well, they're not gun deaths, and so what's the big deal? So as you start to poke holes in this, and you say, well, the homicide rate in Australia was already declining. Right? There's no evidence that this gun restriction is responsible for Australia having the homicide rate that it does. And indeed, historically, it's always been lower than the United States. This is also true with the UK. There's never been a time, never since colonial periods, that the United States didn't have a higher homicide rate than the UK ever. And it's not like the United States has always had more liberal gun laws than the UK. Up until after World War I, the laws were functionally essentially the same. It's only then that they start to diverge. But the homicide rates have always been different, which is a pretty good indicator that there are other significant factors that are essentially causing this. And that the restrictions, again, same in the UK, when they put in their various restrictions, you don't suddenly see a drop in crime or homicide. You see that it ebbs and flows. Same in the United States, same in Australia. So what you get is this Motte and Bailey effect, where the evidence that it affects the homicide rate in Australia is quite poor. However, after the ban was implemented, there haven't been any more mass shootings in Australia. They had the Port Arthur massacre, which again figures very prominently. The closest equivalent in the United States would be to 9/11. Now, obviously, it's insignificant in comparison to 9/11, but it's the only comparison that can be really made. It's the most traumatic, most biggest news event. Everyone remembers it. Whenever I once tried to say it's not that big a deal, the single mass shooting, tragic as it might be, but statistically insignificant, I was met with, oh, no, no, it's absolutely terrible, blah, blah, blah. So there haven't been any more mass shootings in Australia since the restrictions. Ergo, the restrictions have stopped mass shootings. They haven't stopped homicides, right? The homicide rate in Australia isn't zero. The gun homicide rate in Australia isn't zero. The gun homicide and homicide rate in Australia went down after the ban, but they had been going down before, right? If the rate's going down by 10% a year, let's say, and you pass a ban and it continues to go down by 10%, that's pretty strong evidence that the ban has not really had any effect. It might have had an effect. We could speculate that, well, the homicide rate was going to increase, but it didn't increase because of the ban, but we don't see that, right? That is speculative and counterfactual, basically. But you could say, wow, but we never had a mass shooting after that. Well, you've just retreated from a very general broad claim. The overall homicide rate, the overall gun death rate, which is the difference between what you see in the United States and Australia is because of Australia's restrictions. Now you've retreated to it's really only affected mass shootings. Now, that's a significant retreat, right? That is a much more specific claim. It's a much smaller claim. Now, the total number of deaths that are associated with mass shootings as opposed to just individual shootings, it's a huge difference. Where now we're not talking in the United States of the 11,000 homicides per year. I think it's 2-3% are from mass shootings. So we're only talking 2-3%. In Australia, it was even less. Australia had previous mass shootings before Port Arthur, but they average less than once a year. Few and far between. That is statistically insignificant, even relative, even with their smaller homicide rate, it was less than 1% of the total homicides, even in the year of Port Arthur, right? So now they're saying, well, now their big argument, their big advocacy that we adopt these policies is that the restrictions didn't affect homicide in general, but they affected 1% of homicides. Now, that might not be nothing, but that's not very much. That's not that persuasive. We've now retreated very, very far from where we started off. Now, I will say that the fact that there haven't been any in Australia after, that is interesting, but when you have statistically very rare events, the fewer data points you have, the less persuasive the correlation is, right? So if they had been having 30 mass shootings every year and they passed a law and then they had none, I would find that very persuasive. If they were having 10 every year and they passed a law and they never had another one, or maybe they had one or two, I would find that persuasive. If they had 5 and then they never had one, interesting, but it's not a lot of evidence. If they only had one occasionally, every year, every other year, uh, in Australia, and then they had none, these are black swan events. And we don't see this repeated in other countries. So Mexico has similar restrictive laws to Australia, and they have mass shootings. France has restrictive laws, more restrictive than the US, less restrictive than Australia. They have mass shootings. Norway has mass shootings. Germany has mass shootings. The UK, the other country, and we're not supposed to compare, there's special pleading. We can't compare Australia to Mexico or to Brazil or to Russia, but we can compare it to the United States because they're exactly analogous in every criminological way, except for gun laws, apparently. Um, but the UK, they passed their gun restrictions in 1997, and they had a mass shooting in 2008, 2009 in Cumberland. And I say, well, that was only one. Yeah, well, they've only had 3 in their entire history. So 1/3 of their mass shootings happened after their restrictions. And if you say, well, that's such a small number, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah, you're right. That's exactly correct. They're too rare for that to be statistically significant. And that's also true, if to a slightly lesser extent, in Australia. So we have this kind of classic, very bold claims, very adamant, categorical. The restrictions are reducing homicide, they're reducing gun deaths, they're justified, it's plainly obvious. And then we start showing that it's not so obvious, that many countries have similar laws and have high homicide. And if we look at every country that has a higher homicide rate than the United States, they all have more restrictive gun laws than the United States. Every single one. And many of them have gun laws and gun restrictions that are quite comparable and similar, if not more restrictive than those in Australia. And yet they have atrocious homicide. And we have counterexamples of countries that have less restrictive laws than Australia that have lower homicide rates. Again, Iceland being an example. Uh, so and to reiterate a third time, you don't even see it internally within Australia. So there isn't even a correlation there. Correlation equaling causation is a fallacy. I think everybody knows that, but in a clear demonstration of confirmation bias, people don't want to believe that. And it's very comforting to think that, wow, your government has a policy that's protecting you. It's very comforting to believe that they've done something that is protecting you, and it makes, I understand the intuitive argument that, well, they passed a regulation, and the stated purpose of this is to prevent, homicides, to prevent mass shootings, and so intuitively that makes sense, right? Well, sometimes your intuitions can be wrong. I want to have actual data. I want to have actual evidence, and if you break it down and you don't really find it, it's not really there. It's too hazy. It's clear other factors are at work here, that they're the primary drivers. Whether it's changes in the average age, if it's abortion, if it's economics, if it's poverty, if it's, my pet peeve is fucking circumcision. If you looked at Australia, circumcision was popular until 1971, then it became pretty rare, and so all those kids grow up, all those circumcised kids grow up, and a lot of them are angsty and angry, and some of them become mass shooters, and then the circumcision rate drops, and now all of a sudden these happy, intact boys grow up, and even though they have other problems, they're not very unlikely to become mass shooters. It kind of correlates. So does that make it a persuasive argument? No, not really. and neither does a law. Again, uh, people who are intent on committing murder, and again, mass murders are very unusual criminologically speaking, right? Most of the murders, one-on-one violence, a lot of it associated with the war on drugs, a lot of it is crimes of passion, spouse, hatred, fighting over a woman, fighting over attempted robbery, whatever. Not someone who, most criminals, very, very few are intent on killing as many people as possible, let alone suicidally. Um, when you have somebody though who has that mindset and they're dedicated to carrying it out, that's A, super rare, and B, it's very difficult to address that. So, even in countries that do have really strong restrictions, it usually doesn't stop people from doing this. It didn't stop them in the UK, it didn't stop them in France, hasn't stopped them in the Middle East or in Africa or in Latin America, anywhere in Latin America. And so the idea that, well, it must be that in Australia that's stopping them. No, there's very likely other factors at work here, just as there are in other countries. So this kind of retreat from a broader claim to a more specific claim, uh, and then, but and I've had many people admit in debates, well, that maybe doesn't really affect the homicide rate per se, which is not what you're suggesting when you throw out a statistic like look at the total gun deaths of the U.S. and Australia. Um, to well, it stopped mass shootings. Well, that is a much more restrictive claim, and that's the claim that you should make and try and defend. Instead of these much more grandiose arguments. So I know it's kind of ironic having this come out in the aftermath of this shooting in New Zealand, which just happened, which is actually not what I was discussing, which prompted this to be done. It's just a very, very common argument you see, and people use it in other things. It'd be kind of like if I said, well, tariffs make America great. Tariffs have lead to economic prosperity, and you were to point out all the problems without all the fallacies and counterfactuals, and I said, oh no, what I meant is that tariffs are really good for General Motors, right? Automotive tariffs are good for automotive manufacturers. Well, good for America and good for automotive manufacturers are two different things. And pretending otherwise is disingenuous. And the allure of the argument, this is the main thing, is way different. A lot of people love the idea of being great for America. Not that many people are going to be motivated to do something that's good for the auto manufacturers to the detriment of everybody else. Likewise, everybody wants to see the homicide rate go down. Everyone wants to see suicide go down. Everyone wants to see accidental gun deaths go down. Everyone wants to see all those things. But if you're going to retreat and go, oh, well, this is only going to affect this, and then your only piece of evidence is to make a logical fallacy unsupported by any real statistics, then that's just nothing. That's just you having an intuition and then assuming that it's true and ignoring all counter evidence. And there's a ton. It's just not persuasive. If you're going to take, if you're going to infringe on the liberties of other people, of your peers, you need good evidence. You need to have a strong argument. You can't just have a feeling in your gut and a phobia or distrust. That is kind of interesting that uh, at its heart there's a fear of your fellow man. I don't trust them with guns. I don't trust them. They're scary. It scares me. It scares me so much that I would see them banned and have them taken away because if they were allowed to have them, they would be shooting people all the time. And the overwhelming evidence is that the vast majority of people would never do that. And taking away the guns from good people isn't helpful. It's counterproductive. So anyway, that's a quick one out for today, and I will probably talk to you all later. Bye-bye.